Good. So thanks for taking the time.
Sure.
So you're Amy Donaldson from Portland State University, and assistant professor of speech pathology. And thanks for talking with the class and with me.
Sure. So the class is on then, right now?
They're not on, but I post these as videos. And that way, because people are taking the class at all different times. And,
I see. Okay, makes sense.
but this is really enriching, hearing about people's research. So thanks for taking the time.
Sure, absolutely. So my understanding of the charge is to tell a little bit about group-based designs and research. Is that correct?
Yeah, we've been speaking with a number of different researchers about particular studies, and the main question we ask is, what study would you like to share about, and what do you think is interesting about this study? And I think we've kind of made a lot of single-subject design studies kind of accessible and talking about them, and I've shared a little bit about my work. It's been really helpful hearing about different styles of research, so we'd love to hear about some group design experimental research.
So I'll tell you a little bit about a project that we're doing here on campus at PSU. It's called Social Sibs. And what we're doing, it's funded by Autism Speaks. It's a treatment grant pilot level. And we're using waitlist control design, which I'll talk about in just a second.
Oh, nice.
But what we're doing is we're including kids on the spectrum and their neurotypical siblings in a social communication-based intervention. And we're combining two evidence-based practices in kind of a hybrid model. So what we're doing is we're doing what's called video modeling with the kids on the spectrum to directly teach particular social communication skills. And what that entails is identifying with the family a particular social communication behavior. Actually, the sibling serves as a model in the video for demonstrating the behavior multiple times, and then we have the kids watch the video, then they practice it with facilitation.
Yes.
So that's one part of it. The other part is SIB mediation. And what we do is it follows Pierce and Schreiber in 1995 and 1997's model, where they taught peers to work with kids on the spectrum. And really, peer mediation also has been found effective in the literature, and it can kind of go one of two ways. Either we're teaching peers to teach skills to kids on the spectrum, or we're teaching peers to modify their own communication and social behaviors to facilitate growth for kids on the spectrum. And so we're taking the latter approach, and what we do is...
Okay, so it's a partner communication approach. Okay.
Excuse me?
Partner training approach for communication.
What it is peer-mediated. So we're actually communicating directly with, in this case, siblings, and so the goal is written for the sibling, but obviously it's an indirect client model in that whatever we're teaching the sibling, we hope impacts then the child with autism spectrum disorder, right? So we're teaching the sibling pivotal response training strategies, things like gaining your sibling with autism's attention before you say something, responding to all communication bids, offering your sibling choices to maintain their motivation, asking questions to build on communication opportunities, narrating play to model for the child on the spectrum how to talk about what they're doing, those kinds of things.
Yes, yes.
So we do both of those pieces. So it's kind of a multi-layer study in that we do these two components with the kids, but also because the research demonstrates that we have really a high need for pre- and post-professional training for kids who serve, for professionals who serve kids on the spectrum. We've also added that component to it, and so we actually run it through the PSU Speech and Language Clinic here on campus, and our graduate student clinicians participate as part of their practicum experience, and we use what's called an apprenticeship model of supervision, and so we have 2 graduate students for each student, for each sibling dyad. So, for example, one student clinician is the main clinician for the child on the spectrum, and one is the main clinician for the sibling. And then we have a certified licensed speech language pathologist who serves as the master clinician, and she's actually in the clinic room with the student clinicians and the children, modeling, demonstrating, giving on-the-spot feedback, which is very different than traditional supervision in our discipline, where usually it's behind the glass, observing, and then getting the feedback later.
Right.
And then with the apprenticeship model, they apprentice with Tammy Bailey as our supervisor, and then Tammy fades her support as the clinicians demonstrate independence.
Sure.
So it's really kind of this two-tiered model. We're, of course, working to increase social communication skills of kids on the spectrum, but we're also working to, we've now trained, let me think, we've trained 34 graduate student speech-language pathology clinicians in evidence-based practices for working with kids on the spectrum. So that's pretty exciting.
But we spoke with Ann Kaiser from Vanderbilt about her work, and she described her work and you know, herself as a blue-collar researcher. And she was saying intervention work is, you know, you roll up your sleeves and you're you know, doing the work. It sounds like this is that type of hardcore intervention work. That's great.
Yeah, I think that, you know, it's interesting because we pretty much universally hear from our graduate students that this is one, if not the most challenging practicum they have during their experience, yet that's why we provide the maximum support too, because I really firmly believe that given our current incidence of 1 in 68 and 1 in 42 boys, these clinicians are going to encounter working with kids on the spectrum if they go into serving pediatric populations. And so I would much rather have them feel completely in a safe environment to test out how they're going to be working with kids who may be kind of unique and new to them, with a lot of support, rather than, you know, kind of just teaching strategies, so to speak, but really understanding the underlying social motivation hypothesis and getting at the social interaction skills at a deeper kind of mechanism level. So
that's terrific. So that what you've described out is the independent variable and these different parts that go into the independent variable. Sounds like a very thoughtful mix of elements. Really very interesting. Thanks for sharing about that.
And so the research
I remember you walked me down and showed me this, and it was very cool to see it in action, how fluently this was happening. I believe this was once the graduate student clinicians had, you know, they had gotten up to a certain fidelity level, and they looked like they were doing really great intervention work. They looked like they had been doing it forever.
Oh, thanks, Sam. That's great. Just really quickly about the design, because I know that's of interest.
Yes.
It is a waitlist control design.
Okay, so this is an experimental group design where instead of having a traditional experimental and control group, there's folks that are in the experimental condition, and then there's folks who are waiting to get that condition. Absolutely. You can use them as the control, but then ethically, you can then still serve those individuals so that they, by participating, then they still get the benefits, but there's a bottlenecking of resources that, you know, you can't serve everyone, so they go on a wait list. Is that a good description?
That's absolutely the case.
Okay.
And,
wow, that's great to hear about.
Excuse me?
That's great to hear about. I think very interesting for our students.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons a waitlist control can work in this particular kind of study is, first of all, we don't limit their access to any other services they may be doing. That certainly wouldn't work. But we collect those data so we know, you know, if those are variables that may impact response to intervention. The second piece is our intervention is 1 term long. And so, you know, one could say that observing those behaviors, and what we're essentially looking at, our outcome measures are child engagement, reciprocity, initiation, specific social communication behaviors, and then social validity, both from the sibling and from the parent's perspective.
Great. Wow.
And so by monitoring that over that 10-week period, we really aren't withholding intervention for an extended period of time that allows us to say, yes, we feel pretty confident that if behaviors haven't changed over those 10 weeks, and then they do change an intervention that serves as a solid control, but we haven't withheld intervention for such a long time that we believe that we're actually preventing this child from developing the social communication skills that we, of course, believe are beneficial from the intervention.
Sure. That's very interesting. And then, so, Amy, a couple of the students are part of their project are designing proposals. Just a couple people are focused on group design. What kind of sample size are you talking about for your study?
That's a really great question. And of course, you know, to really run a full project, you need to have a statistician do a power analysis to look for the effect size of the measures that you're using and to determine what sample size you would need in order to see the predicted effects with the measures that you're using in the intervention. And you go to the empirical literature, of course, to do that.
Yes.
Since this was a pilot level study,
yes.
We didn't do a full power analysis. We're one of the first, actually, to my knowledge, it's the first study that's combined these two methods that have been found effective. So we can certainly look at those. The measures we use are well established. Looking at engagement has been done by Connie Casseri's group. And looking at the social communication behaviors have been looked at by many different groups. So we certainly have the measures established in the literature. But what we ended up doing was looking at, and this is one of the things that was guided by our funding mechanism, Autism Speaks, was looking at this as really a first step feasibility. So certainly we'll be able to speak to the effectiveness of the intervention, but we are not doing this as a full-scale efficacy intervention at this point, because you build up in your research, of course, and we wanted to see if it's feasible within a university clinic to do this training.
Oh, great.
So we're serving 24 families over the course of 2 years. Excellent. And we'll eventually have 12 families who have served as the control and the waitlist control, and then 24 who've completed the intervention.
Nice, nice. Yeah, we the students had access to reading that CEC article. The lead author is Russell Gersten, about quality indicators for group design, and one of the elements of understanding your sample size is that there's kind of diminishing returns, having larger sample based on that power analysis, but you want to have that minimum to do a valid comparison of the experimental control. But what you're illuminating or highlighting is that has to be based on the particular research question and measures that go there. So that's really helpful to talk about and understand. I know the number 30's kicked around a lot, just kind of as a rough shot for a large number. And we're doing kind of a lower powered, designing a lower powered group design. So it's very interesting, those statistical elements.
Actually, I just had this conversation with a colleague of mine who we're preparing a grant right now. And
yes.
About our statistician hasn't come in yet, but we're just doing some preliminary conversations. And also, when you think about kind of maybe some of the more comprehensive interventions, then the logistics play a role, not only the power analysis, because if you're doing 25 hours a week of intervention, then you have to take into account the logistics and the resource availability in that. And so large-scale studies of an intensive comprehensive intervention may have 24 in the treatment group and 24 in the control group, just because of the nature of the intensity.
Sure.
Whereas, for example, the grant we're waiting to hear about right now would be less intensive. It would be 2 times a week, and our power analysis showed that 60 will have a business-as-usual control group, meaning that folks receive services just as they normally would, and then we'll have our intervention group, our experimental group, and it turned out our power analysis for what we want to look at came out to 60 kids, and we've actually upped, we're going to over-recruit to 80 because of attrition that we can sometimes see in lower intensity intervention. So all of those variables play a role.
Fascinating how the science interacts with how the statistics interact with the science of how we use this research to guide our knowledge on a specific subject. Great. So it sounds like some fantastic research, and it seems like you're getting some good preliminary results, good impact.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I can say certainly all of the kids have achieved at least 2 of their mastered at least 2 of their social communication goals, both for the sibling and the children on the spectrum of a range of 2 to 5. Actually, we had one sibling achieve 7 goals in 10 weeks.
Nice.
So, and so we have those kind of anecdotal data. But one of the things that we're interested in is, can we work on individualized social communication goals, yet see collateral benefits to more global measures, which is the engagement and the reciprocity and initiation. And we've coded about a year's worth of data so far, and the funding ends in December, and so it'll be interesting to finish off that last bit of coding and see where we're at.
That's terrific. Sounds like great work, and the fact that you're involving siblings in this unique way, what looked like quite a bit of fun in actuality. We talk about intervention and research, but these kids are having a lot of fun as they're learning and socializing. So that's really nice.
Well, we use
Really nice
pivotal
to see.
response training as our overarching philosophy, and of course, motivation is one of the key tenets of PRT. And so I always say, you know, our student clinicians are nervous, and I say that time when you go into the session and you start having fun, that's what it's all about. Because the kids are having fun already. You just need to start having fun too. So
that's great. Two last quick questions.
Sure.
These are hopefully kind of interesting to you. What do you think is the most important thing for clinicians to understand about research?
That they're researchers. I always tell my students that they're clinical researchers, or that they're research clinicians, research-based clinicians, because you can't do your job if you're not interested in taking your own data. And for the majority of clinicians, their N is always going to be 1. They're going to have an N of 1, but they can start accruing those data, and that practice-based evidence that they've taken repeated measures on that particular child to know when to change their intervention methodology, how to change their teaching, that the skills are actually generalizing. All of those, I mean, you're doing lots of single subject designs with every student that you serve, or every child that you serve, or every family that you serve. And so I'm a pretty strong advocate that our clinicians are clinician scientists, in my view.
Yes, that's terrific. What a great message to them, that they can use that data they collect, that understanding they collect through observation to drive their instruction or therapy. That's really great.
And I actually take it a step further, Sam. I don't say can, I say you have to. Be a evidence-based practitioner.
Oh, sure,
that's a requirement, right?
Oh,
so,
yes.
And particularly for, not only for our own ethical understanding and confidence that we're doing what's best practice, but third-party payers and education administration and policy change, all of that relies upon the data that we take as individual clinicians.
That's great. It's nice to see that overlap. It makes a lot of sense. The logic is good. So last question, Amy, where do you think educational research should be headed?
That's an interesting question. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that.
Well, it's fairly open-ended. We've heard from a number of folks. Most recently, we spoke with David Chard, the Dean of Education at Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And he had an interesting response. He was saying that he thinks it's fantastic that folks have been really developing great research lines and establishing these evidence-based practices, but also saw a need for being innovative and trying out some things that might be fairly outside the box. And that was a unique take on that. But we've heard kind of different ways people approach it. But yeah.
Well, I have to say, I feel pretty strongly influenced by the mechanism that we just submitted to, which is called PCORI, and it's Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute.
Yes.
And that takes more of a medical view, but I think it's applicable across whatever area we're talking about. And I've always kind of felt that we have this false separation between medical research for kids on the spectrum versus educational research. They should be looking at each other and complementary and supplementary anyway.
Absolutely. I've been reading the community-based participatory research literature, and that's the PCORI. That's really just amazing.
Because by nature I'm a clinical researcher, then my practice is inherently patient-centered or inherently student-centered, depending upon your view. And I really found through going through that process that there's so much more I could be doing. We established, my colleague and I in San Diego, established advisory groups in each locale that included individuals on the spectrum, parents of children on the spectrum, stakeholders, which in this case was speech-language pathologists, hospital administrators, private practice administrators. So you could do, that's analogous to in schools and community service providers and parents and families and children themselves or students themselves, administrators, school teams, all of that. And really, actually, the really unique thing about PCORI is we can't even establish the research questions. It's not like I'm the researcher and I get to identify what's important to you. I actually start from the very beginning saying, here are some things that the research literature shows what's important to you to ask. And we develop it really literally from the ground up, from ideation, and then they are involved all the way through dissemination. It's not just like we started and then we're going to go do our own research. Like, that group stays with you through dissemination of results.
I love that. This recent text in community-based participatory research that I picked up was describing that process of how it's this shared work throughout that line and shared ownership of things like the data and
Yes.
how you disseminate and publish that
Absolutely.
data and how that's used. And like you said, I mean, starting right from what questions you're going to work on. That's so cool. Good for you. Congratulations for submitting to that call.
Yeah, we'll find out soon. Who knows? But one last thing I wanted to say is I also, I teach autism in a lot of different contexts, and one of the things we've been talking a lot about on my classes, and I think it's really important for educators and clinicians and service providers to start thinking more carefully about is the community in support of neurodiversity. And when we're working with kids on the spectrum or kids with special needs in general, that self-determination I think is so incredibly important. And I've seen some resistance to those notions. And so I guess I would say I found it particularly powerful to have individuals on the spectrum as part of my advisory board, or students who are present with these characteristics informing this, because I think we've come to a place where we no longer can kind of say, well, we're going to do it as the interventionists. We actually need to be listening to those voices of folks who are impacted by these differences, neurological differences.
Yeah, I've heard this "nothing about us without us"
Absolutely.
phrase, and that really rings true. And that's great, terrific to hear. Nice. Well, thank you for taking so much time. Thanks for your generosity, Amy.
Absolutely, Sam.
Look forward to connecting again soon.
Right, sounds good. Thanks.
Have a nice day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.